Okay, so we'll dedicate this for a refuah shlema for Yechezkel Yehuda Ben Yenta. Is that right, Sir Avril? Okay, Charlie, come on, Charlie. Let's be having you. Bit more, and not one more push to be better. And hopefully this bit of learning will help him a bit as well too. Right,
Can you
now.
do for my father's yacht site on Friday?
This coming Friday? This
yes,
coming
for my
Friday?
father's yacht site. Yeah.
Okay, and his name?
Aaron Ben Yaakov.
Aharon Ben Yaakov. We should have an aliyah for his neshama. Hopefully his neshama will enjoy this bit of learning as well. Okay, so let's just quickly share the screen and share the screen. There we are. Okay, so what we did last week was we spoke about this arachin hamitaltelin, and I'll very, very quickly whiz through what we did last week. This chap called Rav Gidel Amarav said, Erech kalize alai. Somebody said the erech, the value of this vessel, is what I am going to donate as a donation to the Bet Mikdash. And we had this discussion last time, if you remember, that that's a nonsense vow because a vessel cannot have an erech. An erech, the word erech, only applied certainly in these terms, to a vow to a person. A thing, an object, you have to use a different word, damim, meaning value. It's just two words for the same thing. And we had, if you remember, we had a discussion about the exactness of language that was required with vows. Rav Gidel said that we know what he meant. He said erech, but he meant damim. It's the same thing. And actually, what he really meant was to say damim, and we accept it as a vow. And of course, our friend Rabbi Yaakov ben Elazar, is it Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov? I can't remember. I think it's Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Yes, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says he's our resident pedant Tana, the one that wants 71 judges, a king and a Kohen Gadol measuring corpses. He says, no, if you said erech, it doesn't mean anything. And we ended up saying that we had to emend the Mishnah, if you remember. And we had a discussion about what was the difference between an emendation and an amendment. If you recall, an amendment is something you change. An emendation is something that was wrong in the first place and you correct it to make that's what it said in the first place. So what they said was that grammatically it didn't make any sense. It should say arachin shel metaltalin, the value of movable objects. And then they said, yeah, okay, well, we'll amend the Mishnah then, and that's all well and good. And that's what we did last time. And so we had this discussion as to whether a vow that was made using an incorrect language was acceptable as a vow or not. Rav Gidel, in the name of Rav, said, we know what he meant, don't be silly, of course it's kept. And Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov said, no, he didn't get it right. It doesn't mean anything. It has no legal consequence at all. He does not have to give that the value of that vow. Now, remember that what we are doing here is we are trying to understand the Mishnah. And I'm going to take you back to the Mishnah now, just to show you where we are. I'm going to take you right back to the Mishnah. A lot of introduction stuff here. Preface, hang on, we'll get there in a sec. Another introduction. Another introduction. Hang on, sorry. Here we go. Right. Here's our Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, this is the bit that we're talking about here. Here. Ha'arachin hamitaltalin bishlosha. Those are the three words that we are delving into at the moment. The value, the movable objects with three. That's the literal translation. We've amended the Mishnah now to say, according to Rav Gidel, ha'arachin shel hamitaltalin, the value of the movable objects. Need three valuers, three people to value the amounts. If you say, I donate the value of this mobile phone to the Bet Mikdash, we need to get three mobile phone experts to come along and say how much this thing is worth, and that's how much I have to give to the Bet Mikdash. That's what we're talking about. Those three words. So keep those three words in your mind. Ha'arachin, hamitaltalin, bishlosha. Because what we're going to do now, we're going to go back to page 76 on there. What we're going to do now is to go and say what Rav Chisda has a different opinion to Rav Gidel. And he says like this. We're now on 15a at the top. Rav Chisda, Ama Avimi. Rav Chisda says in the name of Avimi, b'matpis mitaltalin la'archin. Now, what literally this means somebody who connects his movable objects to his to a valuation. So what he said, what he does is, he said, using the correct word of erech, erech applies to what? The word erech applies to a person. So he says, I will give my valuation, erchi, my valuation to the Bet Mikdash. Okay. Now, we know what that is because the Pasuk tells us. I'm just going to show you, remember where we're actually got all this stuff from. Was from a Pasuk in Sefer Vayikra Parashat Bechukotai, chapter 27, which I will show you now, and Jeffrey will read a few verses for us off the screen if you want, Jeff. Here we go. Let's go from verse 2. You're muted, Jeff.
Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man expresses a vow pledging the value of lives to the Lord, the fixed value of a male shall be as follows: from 20 years old until 60 years old, the value is 50 silver shekels, according to the holy shekel.
Let's just stop there. So the value of a male is 50 silver shekels. And then we go on. You don't need to read the whole thing because we read it previously. Female is less. A younger person is less still. An older person is less still. And it's based on their value on the physical labor market. So it's a fixed value. So somebody says, let's go back to the Gemarah now. Somebody says, I pledge to give my own value to the Bet Mikdash. Now, if it was me that said that, I'm over 60 years old, so I would have to give whatever it said there, 20 shekels, to the Bet Mikdash. Now, what happens if I don't have the money? I don't have the 20 shekels, but I do have property. So it's now, I've made a vow. I vow the value of me to the Bet Mikdash. So I promised 20 shekels to the Bet Mikdash, or however much it is for a man over 60. I think it was 20. I will go back and have a look in a minute. Let's say it's 20. And I don't have 20 shekels, but I do have objects. I have this mobile phone. So I then can say, okay, I'll tell you what, I don't have 20 shekels, but I do have a mobile phone. So I'll use my mobile phone to pay my 20 shekel vow to the Bet Mikdash. Are you all with me so far? So how do you know that this mobile phone is worth 20 shekels? Maybe it's only worth 15 or 10 or maybe it's worth 30 and I need change, right? So therefore, says the Mishnah, arachin hamataltalin bishlosha, the value of movable objects that are being used to pay off an erech debt needs 3 valuers. Rav Chisda says that's what the Mishnah is talking about. The case of the Mishnah is as we've just described. I took a vow to pay my value. I didn't have money. I want to pay it off with an object. That object has to be valued by 3 values. That sounds like a very nice explanation, right? Right. Only problem is we've got the same problem that Rav Gidel had, and that is the language, the grammar of the language doesn't work out. So the Gemara says, hang on a minute. Hi arachin hamataltalin. Why does it use this funny expression, values movable objects? It doesn't. It's not a sensible way of writing it. Says the Gemara, mitaltalin shel arachin, the movable objects which you are using to pay off the vows. In other words, they use the movable objects of the vow value of the erech. That's what it should say. That's what it should say. So if Rav Chisda is right, the language of the Mishnah isn't right. So what do you think the Mishnah is going to say? What do you think the Gemara is going to say? You're right.
Take the higher of the 2.
No, you say you're right. We'll amend the Mishnah. We'll make the language fit. Because again, like with Rav Gidel, we had to make his language fit to fit his explanation. Remember, the language of the Mishnah is only shorthand. So Rav Chisda can come along and say, I'm entitled to change this because it was just shorthand. And whoever wrote it down the first time or the second time or the 10th time wrote it wrong. And what it should have said is metaltalin shel arachin. So we now have 2 opinions. Rav Gidel that says it should say arachin shel metaltalin, the value of movable objects. And Rav Chisda who says the opposite. It should have said the movable objects which belong to the value. In other words, we're using it for the value. So who's right? 2 equally good arguments, or equally bad arguments, if you want to say the truth, because both of them require emendation of a Mishnah, which is not something that we do on a regular basis to emend Mishnahs. So if we have to amend the Mishnah, it means that we've got a bit of our backs to the wall. We don't like to mess with the language of the Mishnah unless we have to. So 2 equally good or equally bad ideas. Now, here comes a 3rd question of the Gemara now. We're over here. Rabbi, have you got it on the screen, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Rabbi Abahu Amar, Rabbi Abahu said, but Omer, the Mishnah is talking about a case with somebody who says, Erki alai, I give the value of me to the Bet Mikdash. So my 20 shekels again. Only I don't have the money. And not like the previous case where I come along and say, I'd like to use this to pay off my vow. The guy does nothing. He doesn't cough up. He makes a vow. How many times have we seen that when you've been collecting money for good causes, right? People pledge money and they don't cough up. You have to go and you have to go and get it. Well, this is what happens in our case. Look, he never pays up. So what happens? Ba Kohen, the Kohen comes, ligbot mimenu metaltalin. The Kohen comes to, he's the bailiff. The Kohen here is the bailiff. He's coming to take objects to the value of what you vowed. So instead of me coming along and saying, I'd like to use the value of this, the Kohen knocks on my door and says, you owe 20 shekels to the Bet Mikdash. I'm coming to have a look around what I can take. And in that situation, says Rabbi Abahu, Bishlosha, we need 3 people to accompany the Kohen Bailiff to value the property. Not good enough that the bailiff on his own, the Kohen on his own, comes on and says, oh, that looks worth about 20 shekels. I'll have that. Thank you very much. No, says the Mishnah, it's got to be 3. Bishlosha. So that's now a third explanation of our Mishnah. So from this, you can see how difficult it is because the Mishnah was so concise. The Mishnah said 3 words, Ha'arachin, Metaltalin, Bishlosha. When we learned that Mishnah over 3 years ago, we just thought it meant what it said. Well, the Gemarah now, 3 years later, is telling us, hang on a minute, it could mean all sorts of things. And we've got three opinions here on what it means. So let's just carry on, and we'll come back in a second to try and work what's going on out. Says the Gemarah, we go back to the Mishnah, Karkaot ba'asara. Remember, I told you there's a difference between movable objects and karka. Karka is land. Okay, you can't move land. So in Jewish law, there are 2 types of property. There's 3 types of property. There's people, there's land, and then there's everything else. Everything else is called metaltalin, whether you can move it or not. A car, you might not be able to move it, but it's called a movable object. It's not land. It's not a person, and it's not land. It's called metaltalin. It's called an object, a movable object. So in Jewish law, there are 3 types of property: land, movable objects, and people. Now, in valuation terms, people is the easiest. Why are people so easy?
Was it set out?
You've got fixed values.
Yeah, they've got fixed values. There's no discussion. Fixed values. You say, I give the value of so-and-so. All you need to know is how old he is and what gender he is. That's all. And then you know what that might not be so easy these days, actually, to know what gender they are. But anyway, another story. As long as you can establish, halachically at least, what gender they are and how old they are, then it's easy. You know the value because it's set out clearly in the Torah. But a movable object, we've just said, needs how many valuers? 3. Karkaot, look over in the Gemarah here. Karkaot, land, ba'asara. We need 10. Remember, there was an opinion, Rabbi Yehuda said that one of those 10 had to be what? Can you remember?
You have to be an expert.
No, they all have to be experts. One of them has to be, according to Rabbi Yehuda, a Kohen. One of them has to be a Kohen. Because why? Because we had it already, didn't we? That whole chapter that we were talking about mentions the word Kohen how many times altogether? 10. 3 for values, 3 for movable objects, and 4 for land. So here, the Mishnah says that it's 10 for land. Okay, so Amalei Rav Acha midifti. This chap Rav Acha lived in a place called Difti, and he said to Ravina, another fellow, Bishloma la'afuki mehekdesh ba'inon shlosha. I understand the opinions of Rav Gidel and of Rav Chisda, because what they're saying is somebody who owes money to Hekdesh, right? What you're trying to do is you're trying to take money out of Hekdesh. You owe money to Hekdesh, to the Bet Mikdash, and you are trying to take that money out in order that you can redeem the money and give an object. So I understand that, says Rav Acha. He says, I understand why you need to be very, very careful about this and need 3 people to value the object. Because let's say you did it yourself, or you only had one person to value it. And I've said, according to Rav Chista's opinion, I've said I give my value of myself to the Bet Mikdash. We know that's 20 shekels. And I come along and I say, I think this is worth 20 shekels. Or one valuer comes along and says, yeah, I think that's worth 20 shekels. And it turns out that it's only worth 10 shekels. So what is the consequence of that? What's the consequence if that's really only worth 10 shekels?
It's underpaid.
I've underpaid, which means I have taken out something that belongs to the Beit Mikdash. I've taken out 20 shekels because that belongs to the Beit Mikdash because I promised it. And I've replaced it with something worth 10. So I have taken 10 shekels worth of Bet Mikdash property. Understood? Effectively, if this is undervalued, I have taken out from the Bet Mikdash 10 shekels worth. That is an aveira in the Torah, a serious aveira in the Torah. Does anybody know what it's called? We mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. It sounds like a bris. It's called me'ilah, not mila, but me'ilah. Mem, ayin, yud, lamed, hey. If you do that, you are somebody who is called a mo'el, not a mohel with a hey, a mo'el, somebody who has done me'ilah. Now, let me just, there is a whole masechet me'ilah. So there's a whole tractate to describe what goes on with me'ilah. But I'm just going to share with you a little summary of what me'ilah is all about that I found this morning. Let's see, here it is. Let me share the screen with you. Here we go. Me'ilah. Can you see that on the screen now? Okay. The 8th tractate in the Mishnah, Tosefta, and Babylonian Talmud order of Kodashim. Me'ilah contains 6 chapters and deals with the unlawful use and enjoyment of hekdesh, i.e. things consecrated to the temple, especially sacrifices, but not only sacrifices. So the scriptural basis is in Vayikra, which lays down that a person inadvertently committing a trespass in holy things shall bring a guilt offering, make a restitution for the loss, and pay an additional fine. So it's a serious business, okay, this me'ilah. Now, if our valuer, our one valuer makes a mistake, and this is only worth 10 shekels and not 20 shekels, then I will be guilty of me'ilah. And then not only will I have done an aveira, I'll have to bring a sin offering, I'll have to make up the 10 shekels that I've not paid, and I get a fine on top of it. So, in order to avoid that, our Mishnah goes and says, well, we don't want to be getting into that kind of nonsense, do we? What we want to do is to be absolutely sure that the object that you are paying off your debt with is worth what you say it's worth, so that we will have 3 judges. When it comes to land, we want 10 judges, or valuers, I should say. Presumably, because land is more difficult to value, and therefore you need a bigger pool of people, I guess. So, Rav Acha's question is this. Bishloma, I understand la'afuke me hekdash, that when you're taking something out of hekdash, we need 3, ba'inan shlosha. We're going to need 3 judges for the reason I've just said, because we want to make sure that I'm not taking things out which belongs to hekdash and using it. Ela la'ayulei lahekdash, shlosha lamali. But to elevate property into the status of consecration, why do I need 3 judges? Because if this is according to Rabbi Abahu, what the bailiffs are coming along, in his case, the bailiff comes along and takes the property. Worst scenario, if he doesn't take enough of property, if he takes something which is undervalued, worst scenario is the guy still owes the money. It's not the fellow himself who said, here, this is worth 20 shekels. It's the bailiff. The Kohen has come and said, I'm taking this because it's worth 20 shekels. So why do we need 3? Worst scenario is you get to the Bet Mikdash and they do a life of Brian. They say, what, 10 for that? You must be mad. That's not worth 10. I'm only giving you 5 for it, right? And so, okay, so it's worth 5 or it's worth 10, whatever it is. There's still a balance left. So there's no problem because the bailiff can go back and get some more. So the question of Rav Acha is, why do I need 3 in that scenario? I understand the first 2 cases because I don't want this chap to be guilty of doing this Aveira called Me'ilah, of using the Bet Mikdash's property. But according to Rabbi Abahu's, Rabbi Abahu's opinion, which is that it's a bailiff job, why he's not guilty of anything except just being slovenly in paying his pledge. That's all. So Amalei, so Ravina, who was having this discussion with him, answers him, and he says, you know what? You're right. And what he's about to say, you do see quite often in the Gemarah. And in my humble opinion, it's not very satisfactory answer. Because what we're going to do now is just to use a linguistic tool. And he says, svarahu. It's a matter of logic. Mali ayulei, mali afuke. What difference does it make whether I'm putting in or I'm taking out? Afuke, my tama. Well, if I'm taking out like the first 2 cases, I don't want the guy to be guilty of me'ilah, so I'm going to make sure with 3 judges. Why? My tama. Why? Dilma ta'e. Maybe the one judge will make a mistake, and we're worried about that. Ayulinami. So when we're doing it the other way with the bailiff, Dilma ta'e, maybe he'll make a mistake, and we're consistent. We want to have linguistic consistency. So even though Rav Abahu's, Rav Achami Difti's objection actually is a good objection, Ravina says, don't be such a pedant. It's fine. It's just, the second case is only to make it sound the same. So we've got linguistic continuity with the 2 cases. And so he said, we're worried that there'll be a mistake and then the temple will lose out, even though we're not worried about the guy doing me'ilah. Okay, so that's the end of that particular piece of Gemarah. And to summarize, we had 3 words. We had in the Mishnah, we had arachin, metaltalin, bishlosha. And out of those 3 words, we made a whole geschichte of 3 different opinions of what it could mean. We had the opinion of Rav Gidel, who said that he made a mistake with a language, and he meant to say damim instead of erechin, and we knew what he meant, so that was fine. And then we had Rav Chisda, who said this was his way of paying off something which he'd made a value of himself. He didn't have the money, so he wanted to pay with goods. And we had Rabbi Abahu, who said he made a vow on himself or on a person's value, and he didn't pay up at all. And the Bet Mikdash had to send a big burly Kohen as a bailiff to go and collect So those were the three different opinions, and each opinion had its problem, because the first two opinions had problems with the language of the Mishnah, and each of the first two opinions had to amend the language of the Mishnah to fit their opinion. Reb Gidel had to change it to arachin shel mitaltalin. Reb Chista had to change it to mitaltalin shel erachin, or that's a bigger change even. And Rebbe Bahus wasn't even logical, and he had to rely on linguistic continuity for his. So the bottom line is that we've got three opinions on what these three words mean, and none of them really are entirely satisfactory. What do we make of all that? What's the halacha? Well, it doesn't really matter anymore, because we haven't got a Bet Mikdash and we haven't got Hektish. When we do, I guess, by the time we've got a Bet Mikdash, Eliyahu Hanavi will have come and told us what the answer is. But it's what's fascinating is how detailed the discussion is on those three words that 3 years ago we didn't see any issues with whatsoever. We just learnt those three words and understood them fully. Well, actually, we didn't understand them at all until we came to now. And now we do understand them, but we don't actually know which is the most appropriate, because all three of them have got difficulties. So that's that little bit. Now, we've not quite finished with that. Those psukim. Let's go back to the psukim that Jeffrey started to read a little earlier. Let me get them back on the screen. There we go. Right. Now, Jeffrey started to tell us the value of the people. By the way, was I right? It was 20 shekels for a male over 60. No, 15. See, I'm not even worth 20 shekels. I'm only worth 15. So there you go. Right. So what we then did is in these psukim, we went and we discussed from here, from verse 11 onwards, what we should do if we needed to redeem it. So in other words, I say, I am going to give this particular animal as a sacrifice in the Bet Mikdash. And it turns out that that animal is either not a kosher animal and can't be shechted at all on the Bet Mikdash, or it is a kosher animal, but it's got some kind of blemish and it's not able to be sacrificed. So we have to swap it. We have to redeem it onto something else. Because I said, this particular animal, well, I can't fulfill my vow, can I? I've made a vow that I can't fulfill, because I said, this particular cow or sheep, I will give to the Bet Mikdash. And I can't, because it's got a blemish. Or I stupidly said, this pig I'm going to give to the Bet Mikdash. Well, I can't sacrifice a pig in the Bet Mikdash. So we have to redeem that, the value of that, onto something else. And how do we do that? By valuation. And these psukim tell us that the Kohen is heavily involved in this. And as we said before, how many times in this section does the word Kohen appear? How many times, Jeffrey? 10 times, correct. 10 times. So clearly the Kohen is key to this whole thing. So these verses here, the Kohen here, Kohen shall evaluate it, the Kohen evaluates. Here again, where are we? Kohen shall calculate, sold the field, Kohen, there's another Kohen there. 10 times it mentions Kohen. So let's go back to the Gemarah and have a look. We might have to go back to the Mishnah. Well, let's go back to the Gemarah first and see what the Gemarah is telling us. There's the Gemarah again. We've come to a little S. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, what does this mean here? Chaf Vav, we had it last time. Chaf Vav with a little chubchik. Avril, it's on the tip of your tongue. What does it mean? Don't remember. Jeffrey, can you remember?
I can't remember anything.
It remains etc. Remember?
Yeah.
It stands for kula, all of it. So Rabbi Yehuda says etc. Well, you're meant to know what he says. Where does he say it? In the Mishnah, right? But you're meant to know that Mishnah off by heart. Well, of course we don't, do we? So we have to go right back to the Mishnah and see what is he talking about. The Mishnah, what the Gemarah wants to discuss what Rabbi Yehuda said, but it doesn't tell us what he said because we're meant to know it off by heart. Well, because we're all a bit dumb and we don't know it off by heart, we have to go all the way back to the Mishnah and there we go. Here it is. Here we go. We just said this, didn't we? Ha'arachin hamitaltelim bishlosha. That's what we've just been discussing. And the next words are Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, what's the etc.? The etc. is Echad Mehen Kohen. One of these three has to be a Kohen. That is what the Gemarah is now going to discuss. And the Gemarah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, etc. So, in case you didn't know it off by heart, there it is in front of us. One of the three, or one of the 10 when it comes to the land, has to be a Kohen, right? So, let's see what the Gemarah's got to say about that. Here it is. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, etc. One of the three has to be a Kohen. So, Rav Papa has got a question. Amale Rav Papa la Abaye. Rav Papa says to Abaye, Bishlama, that's okay, I understand that, the Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Hainu dichtiv Kohen. He's the one that says that, according to his opinion, the whole Torah portion is about a Kohen. So what about the rabbis? Elul Rabbanan, what about the first opinion, the dissenting opinion from Rabbi Yehuda, who don't say, he says that anybody can do that. Kohen lama lahu. Why do the rabbis need, what do they do with all those words Kohen? 10 times it mentions Kohen. Rabbi Yehuda says there's a good reason for that, because one of these valuers must be a Kohen. The rabbis say, no, one of these, all three of them can be non-Kohanim. Doesn't have to be a Kohen. So the question that Rav Papa has is, well, if that's the case, why is that whole section full of the word Kohen? What are the rabbis going to do with all those words Kohen? Rabbi Yehuda uses that fact and says, because it keeps on mentioning Kohen, it's hinting to us that one of the judges needs to be a Kohen. Makes logic, no? So the question is against the rabbis. What are they going to do with all those words Kohen? What do they learn from it? Rabbi Yehuda learns that one of the judges must be a Kohen. Rabbis say no, is not the case. So what are they going to do with the word Kohen all that time? And the answer, kasha. They don't know. Don't know. Gemarah does not have an answer. Meaning that we have a disagreement between Rabbi Yehuda, who puts forward a very logical argument. The rabbis disagree with him, but they can't back up their argument. So who are we going to believe? who are we most likely going to go with? If it was me, I'd go with Rabbi Yehuda, because he's got a logical reason for his argument. His argument makes logical sense. The rabbis, they're stuck. They've got their backs to the wall. They can't explain why this parsha says the word Kohen so often. The problem is that the rabbis are in the majority. And we know that generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the halakha follows the majority. And even if the majority opinion appears to be less logical and not able to be explained, if it's the majority, generally speaking, we go with the majority. So here, this is rather an unsatisfactory piece of Gemarah. The whole thing really is unsatisfactory, because remember, what the Gemarah is all about is explaining what the Mishnah meant. The Mishnah was written down by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in shorthand form to help us understand the halacha. He didn't do a great job, seemingly, because if he'd done a great job, we wouldn't need all this Gemarah to explain it. It would have been clear. But he wrote it in a shorthand way that really there were too many different ways to interpret what he'd written. And that's what the Gemarah does. Throughout every single Masechta, it takes a piece of Mishnah, like we've just done now, taking those 3 words and carves it to pieces to try and understand what actually Rabbi Yehuda Nasi meant. And what we normally do with a piece of Gemarah is we come to a conclusion about what it meant. So you'd have a discussion and somebody would say X, somebody would say Y, and then X would give his reason, Y would give his, and eventually one of them would give in and say, you know what, you're right, I concede. Here, we've got several different opinions, none of whom concede, and they all come up with different explanations which aren't really satisfactory. We've got to amend the Mishnah, change the wording of the Mishnah. We've got to go with a bit of linguistic acrobatics. And at the end of it, the rabbis say, I've got no answer for you, but I still don't agree with you. So all in all, this piece of Gemarah, whilst it's interesting to see how the arguments develop and how sophisticated their logical thinking was, it doesn't actually help us fully understand the halacha, and that's why we need the poskim to actually eventually tell us what the halacha is, because we don't come to any satisfactory conclusion. We've not quite finished this matter yet, because we're still in the same chapter. Let's go on. We've got another few minutes. I need to finish on time today. We've still got a few more minutes. And we're at a new little symbol of S, which means it's a little discrete section on its own. Hakarkaot tish'a v'chohein. We've said land needed how many valuers? 10. 9 and a kohen. So the Gemarah asks the question, and we have referred to this earlier on. Mina hane mili. That's a classical Gemarah expression. Mina hane mili. Where do these words come from? In other words, how do you know? How do you know you need 9 and a kohen? Well, we know this, don't we? Because we learnt it earlier on, a couple of weeks back. Because Amar Shmuel says, and remember, when we spoke about Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's opinion, we said, he goes like Shmuel. And we quoted this piece of Gemarah a bit earlier on. Amar Shmuel says, Asara Kohanim Ketuvin Beparasha. 10 times Kohen is Ketuvin. What's Ketuvin? Written, correct, Avril? 10 times the word Kohen is written Beparasha in our little section of Torah, which Jeffrey started to read. Okay, very nice. We know that it's 10. I'm not going to take you back and count them up because we've already done it. We've counted it. It's 10 times. 3 for the valuation of a person, 3 for the valuation of things, and 4 for the valuation of land. So that's your 10. So says this piece of Gemarah, Chad legufei, one mention of the word Kohen is legufei. What's a guf? What's a guf? We say about HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Yigdal. What did you say, Avril? You're muted. Unmute.
Body.
Body, correct. Guf means a body. We say about HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Yigdal, Ein lo demut haguf ve'eino guf. He doesn't have any form of a body, and he doesn't have a body. We're talking about Hashem. Hashem is extra corporeal. Okay, it's a fancy word for saying he doesn't have a body. So guf means body. So chad legufei, one mention of the word Kohen is for the body of the matter, of the body of the issue, for the matter itself. Hanach have miut, achar miut, and the rest of them is a restrictive expression following a restrictive expression. And miut means something which excludes from ma'at. What does ma'at mean? A little, yeah. If you said, somebody says to you, would you like some cake? And you say, ma'at, a little. Or you could say harbe, a lot. But, you know, if you only wanted a little, you'd say ma'at. Miut means to make it smaller. So this is a restrictive clause. And when it's a bit like a double negative. If I say to you in English, I'm not going to the match, meaning I am going to the match, right? A double negative is a positive. Same here. When you have two restrictive clauses after one another, it's an inclusive clause. So a little of a little means more, okay? Miut acha miut, ela l'rabot. A restrictive expression following a restrictive expression serves only to amplify and include other matters. In this case, teaching that even 9 Israelites and 1 priest may perform the valuation. Now, there's a little N here. So let's have a look at the N. Where's the N take us to? Notes. Here we go.
Johnny.
Yes.
In if two negatives don't make a positive.
No, they don't. That was an English comparison. You're right. 2 negatives don't. Well, it depends how you say it. But when you say a negative in Ivrit, it sounds like it's 2 negatives sometimes. But it depends on the context. But you're right. Let's have a look how he explains this miut achamiut. There is a hermeneutical principle. What's that? What's a hermeneutical principle? Jeffrey and Michael, you should know what a hermeneutical principle is, because I've no doubt that you said 13 of them this morning. Michael and Jeffrey were both in shul this morning. So I know that you've said 13 hermeneutical principles. Come on, what have you said 13 of this morning, Michael?
Just before the Rabbanon Kaddish.
Correct. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Bishlosha Esrei Midot HaTorah Nidreshet, with 13 hermeneutical principles. Another word for it, which is translated in the various Sidurim, is exegetical principles. Okay, if that helps you. I don't suppose it does. I don't remember the last time I used the word hermeneutical or exegetical in everyday language, but basically it means there are 13 principles of how we derive things from Psukim. Hermeneutical and exegetical are fancy language for deriving things out of. So there is a hermeneutical principle. There is a principle in the way we darshan, the way we understand the Torah. And one of those is that a restrictive expression following a restrictive expression serves only to amplify, i.e. to teach the opposite of what the first restrictive expression implied. Okay? And then the same thing applies a rabot, acharei rabot, to amplify something after an amplification reduces something. Okay? And you're going to say to me, why, aren't you? Well, yes, you're going to say, why? That doesn't make any logical sense. Well, you're right. Look what he says. According to some, these hermeneutical principles are to be viewed as Torah edicts that cannot be logically explained. In other words, it just is. Okay, that is, and that's why they're in there. Rabbi Yishmael has to tell us about them, because you can't work it out for yourself, because it's not logical. That's according to some. Others suggest that these principles are based on the premise that only one restrictive expression or amplification was necessary. Had there only been one, it would be obvious. The presence of the additional one indicates that it is not to be understood in a legal context, and that the Torah used the term simply as a manner of speech. In this case, had the Torah used the word priest exactly one time, it would be used to infer the necessity of a priest to perform the appraisal, because that's what it says. Since the word is used multiple times, it is apparent that the verse refers to a priest only by way of example, meaning, according to the rabbis, that it doesn't have to be 10 priests. 9 and 1 is sufficient. Difficult to understand that whole concept because it's not logical. It's one of those things that just is. And again, that's why Rabbi Yishmael had to teach it to us, because we couldn't have worked it out for ourselves. In the same way as you cannot read the Shema and say, Ukashartam la'ot al yadecha, and you shall bind them on your hands, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. How do you know that that means a black box and black straps and 7? You can't work it out from there. It just is. What we call Torah leMoshe miSinai. It's Torah that Moshe received at Har Sinai and passed it on through the generations, through the oral law, until Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, if I don't write this down, it's going to get lost because of the dispersion after the second Bet Mikdash was destroyed. I better write it down. He wrote it down in note form. 400 years later, all these rabbis are sitting around saying, I wonder what he meant by that. And we end up with the situation that we end up with here. So an interesting piece of Gemarah that we've finished here, because what it means is, what it's demonstrating to us is that although the Gemarah in large parts is based on very, very sophisticated logic, there are certain things that are just not logical, and just we have to accept it's part of our faith in what we call the Mesorah, the tradition, the passing on. The word, you've heard the word Mesorah, yeah? Mesorah means tradition, okay? Tradition. Right, do you know what the root of that word is? The root of the word is meser, mem, samach, resh, Mesorah. What's a meser in modern Hebrew? Yes, Avril, unmute so that everyone listening to the recording can hear you.
A message.
A message, correct. Meser is a message. What is a Mesorah? What is a tradition doing? It's giving us a message. What's the tradition from our families? Our family mottos, our family message. What's our family message, Jeffrey? You can forgive, but you never forget, right? That's the Mesorah of the Lieberman family, right? That's the Meser, that's the message. Truth is, you don't forgive either, but that's the real truth. But anyway, right? So this is Mesorah. This is the tradition. So there are certain things in the Gemarah that we just have to accept as Mesorah. It's a message. It's handed down from generation to generation, and there are certain things that just defy logic. So it's fascinating to see, because the Gemarah mostly is engaged in trying to come up with very, very logical arguments. One person is trying to better the next in terms of logical arguments. And in other places, we just hold up our hands and say, it's not logical, but we accept it came from Har Sinai, through Moshe, through Yoshua, through the elders, through all that chain of tradition of Mesorah, and it ends up in this Gemarah. And in 2022, we are all sitting around learning this and gaining from it. So it's a fascinating thing, even when we can struggle with the concept of it on an intellectual and logical basis. On an emotional basis, it's still there. And that's why, by the way, there are people who are not religious, who don't believe in God at all, certainly don't believe in Moshe Rabbeinu and the giving of the Torah, but they learn Gemarah. Why? Because they enjoy the intellectual stimulation of the sophisticated arguments of Gemarah. But when it comes to this type of Gemarah, they will not be satisfied, because they haven't got that little bit of X factor that we have that says, it's not logical, but it's part of my Mesorah. My grandfather learned this, his grandfather learned it, and his grandfather before him learned it, and so I'm going to learn it, and my grandchildren are going to learn it, please God. So if you miss that, it might be a very interesting intellectual exercise to learn Gemarah. And, by the way, I think it's South Korea. Gemarah is in the national curriculum of, I think it's South Korea, really? Because it's such a good training for the mind to work out logic that they actually have Gemarah in their national curriculum. I think it's South Korea. I'll check it out. But it's one of those, sort of Asian countries where they're all dead clever. They learn Gemarah, but of course they don't have the Mesorah. And when it comes to this, they won't really get this. So I just think that's an interesting point to pull out from the Gemarah. So what have we done today? Let's just recap. We said Rav Chisda's opinion. We recapped Rav Gidel's opinion that he got the language wrong, and we don't get too uptight about it. Rav Chisda said that this was him paying his vow with an object. Rabbi Bahu said, no, we had to send the bailiff for him to cough up. None of those things really were logically proven. And then we had a bit of linguistic acrobatics that said, well, why do we need to have three if it's the bailiffs? Let him go back and get some more. And he said, no, if we're saying it with one, we'll be consistent in our language, even though we don't really need it. And then we spoke about the Kohen. Rabbi Yehuda was consistent because he says we need a Kohen. The rabbis didn't really know what to do with all those 10 mentions of Kohen, and they hold their hands up and say, well, I don't know, it's difficult, but I'm sticking to my guns. And then finally, today, we learned this hermeneutical, exegetical principle, which defies logic, really. But with our Mesorah, with our tradition, we accept that this is the way that we interpret the Torah, as explained to us by the famous Rebbe Yishmael, who gets a mention every morning, as you say, Michael, before Rabbanon Kaddish. Any questions on today's shiur?
Shakar. It's all very analytical. Sometimes it's a little bit too much for my baby brain.
Well, it doesn't matter, Jeffrey, because the fact is that, every little bit has got a value to it, okay? There'll be bits of logic that you'll think, I don't quite get that. But if you were to go back and look at it...
It's not, to me, some of it is illogical.
Okay. But you'll find that your logic will tally with one opinion.
Yeah.
And you'll prefer the logic of A to B.
Yeah.
And that's fine. You're entitled to do that. And that's why, Rabbi A didn't agree with Rabbi B. If he did, we wouldn't need a Gemarah. So it doesn't really matter that, you know, if you don't agree with the logic or you don't get the logic. The fact is that we can marvel at, you know, 1,500 years ago, the sophistication of thought process, the sophistication of recording it, and the arguments behind it. And occasionally the holding your hands up and says, you know what, it's not logical, but it's tradition and we accept it. And that in itself is of great value as well, because we are a link in a very, very long chain going back, and hopefully a very long chain going forward as well.
But Johnny, just a point, someone could have something which is very valuable to them, but of absolutely no value to other people. Because possibly it was used by a parent or a grandparent or handed down, but it really has a nil value in the marketplace. Now, you haven't actually mentioned that.
Well, I think that's implied, Jeff, because that's why you have three valuers, because it's all about market value, and those valuers have to be an expert in the market. It's no good me saying, you know, this mobile phone belonged to my father and it's very precious to me, and I personally would give you £100 for it. It happens to be worth £5 on the open market. Well, the Bet Mikdash is not interested in what I'm going to give for it. It's interested in the market value. And that's exactly the point, because somebody may come along and say, you know what, I love these phones. I used to have exactly the same one myself 15 years ago, and I'm willing to pay a bit more for a bit of nostalgia. Well, the other two would say, well, that's all very well, Mr. Valuer, but how are we going to sell it on the open market to get money for the Bet Mikdash? And that's exactly the reason, I think, why the Gemarah is saying that you can't just have one valuer, you've got to have three to get a proper market value. I think the point that you raise is exactly right. It's implied in the whole idea of having three valuers that we are not sentimental here. We're not dealing with sentimental value. We're dealing with value on the open market. Okay, any other questions? Okay, we will meet again shortly.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What did you say, Michael?
Oh. So thanks very much.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you had said something else. Bye, everyone.
Okay, cheers.